Good afternoon. Hello. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 2025 forecast. I am going to introduce a man that really doesn't need any introduction because most of us know him. We are very grateful to have Stan Longhoffer with us. He has been doing this for us for a lot of years. I'll let him tell you how many. And if you would just help me in giving him a warm welcome, we will get started.
Thanks so much. I think I have on a lavalier, so I'm okay without this one. Wow, it's such a great pleasure to be here and to present with all of you. I have to say, this is my favorite part of what I get to do is interacting with all of you. And really, it's a two-way street in all the things that I do. I sometimes joke that my job is to go and listen to a bunch of real estate professionals talk to me about what they are finding and seeing in the markets. And then I come back and I will present to them and I repeat what they told me. And you think I'm really, really smart as a result. So it really has been a wonderful collaborative experience. For those who have not heard, I have actually announced that this will be my last year running the real estate program at Wichita State University, and I'll be moving into a 3-year phased retirement at the end of this year. I'll still be teaching, I'll still be around in the community, I'll still be available, and hopefully you'll invite me back to do some things from time to time. But we should, a year from now, we should have a different person. The university is in the process of hiring my replacement, who will be overseeing the real estate program and building it, taking it to the next and higher levels. So it's been a great pleasure. I just finished my 25th year at the university, and this May will be the 25th anniversary of the Center for Real Estate. And so that was a nice round number, a good time to kind of say, okay, this comes complete. And the theme then for this year's forecast that we have is full circle. And it felt like it was full circle for me, but it also really feels like it's coming full circle in the markets. And we'll talk about what I think with that. I will just mention, I do have my slides from today's presentation are available on the Center for Real Estate website. If you go to wichita.edu/real estate, sorry, I didn't put a QR code up there for that, but you can type that into your browser. And if you scroll down, you'll see, even on your phone, if you scroll down, you'll see latest data, and then you'll see latest presentations. And it's right there, so you can follow along, look and kind of get ahead of the game if you want to and see where I'm headed with things. I also have to give a huge thanks to Security First Title and Fidelity Bank for sponsoring the forecast this year. Security First has been such a tremendous friend all the way back to their First American Title days and everything in between. They have sponsored what was originally the Wichita Housing Forecast, and then became the whole Kansas Housing Markets Forecast series for all the markets across the state. They have done that every year since we started, which I think was in 2004. And so we're very grateful for that. And we're excited. Fidelity Bank has been a sponsor of the Kansas City Housing Forecast for a number of years. And this year they've picked up and are doing the sponsorship for the Wichita Forecast. So we're very grateful for that. And I am such a big believer, even though electronic is wonderful, there's no substitute for having something that's a high quality publication in your hands. You know that with your marketing materials too. And so because of these generous sponsorships, we are able to print these copies, and there are a lot of boxes out there, and you may think, oh, no problem, I can get them anytime. Take 2, 3, 4 boxes with you when you go. First of all, Alvina will appreciate it because they won't be out there. And that's what our life is about, right? Making Alvina happy. She's done so much to make us happy. We ought to be making her happy too. But many years, we get around to January and people call up and say, I need another box of the forecast. And we have to say, I'm sorry, we ran out. And so last year we had a few extra copies, so we didn't print quite as many this year as we did last year. So make sure you take your boxes now because they may not be there later. And again, they're great for putting in relocation packets, listing presentations and other materials. So please take advantage of them. And then when you do, thank the sponsors for making that possible. So I'm going to spend more time today talking about some economic issues that are underlying things in the general economy, and then really driving, my goal with all of that is to really focus on mortgages and what's going to be happening with mortgage rates going forward. And if I do a spoiler for my sort of conclusion that I'm going to draw, is that we are finally back in a world where mortgage rates are normal and should be staying there for the foreseeable future. And so now I want to talk about why I think that's the case and all the things that are going on with the Federal Reserve and their movements. And we all know that the Fed a few weeks ago began the process of lowering their short-term interest rate target. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But the Fed has really been in this balancing act for a number of months of feeling like, well, inflation has been coming down. We've got inflation closer to our target, but it's still above where we want it to be. The Federal Reserve has an explicit in long-term inflation target of 2%. That's what they consider to be a level of low, stable inflation that does not result in any distortions in other economic activity, okay? So that's their goal. And they're always trying to balance that when they move their short-term interest rates, when they raise short-term interest rates, that tends to depress economic activity and it tends to put downward pressure on the inflation rate. When they lower their short-term interest rates, that can help stimulate economic activity, but if it overdoes it, it can also lead to an acceleration of inflation. And so the Fed's trying to find that balance. And there have been a lot of mixed economic signals here. So this chart is looking at real gross domestic product growth. It's all the goods and services that are produced in the economy. Believe it or not, every time you close a sale on a home, you are being added into the GDP. You're creating a service, you're providing a service and creating value out of that process. Most recently, the GDP growth in the second quarter was up about 3%, which is a really strong number. It was revised upward. So that is solid economic growth. That might cause the Fed to say, you know what, we don't want to lower short-term interest rates. We might overheat the economy. They've also been looking at the unemployment rate. And so this is looking at people and what percentage of people who want jobs can't find them. And the unemployment rate is still very, very low, but it has been going up every single month for several months. And there is some history to suggest that when the unemployment rate starts going up slowly for several months in a row, that can lead to bigger increases in the unemployment rate in the coming months. So even though the unemployment rates are very low right now by historic standards, this signal tells the Fed, maybe we need to be moving to lower interest rates so that the economy doesn't go too bad. You know, we have these high short-term interest rates. Will that cause the economy to move into recession? We don't want to hold it back too much, so we may pull down those short-term interest rates because of that, and because of this situation. We were in another way to look at the labor market is to look at the jobs or the total employment numbers. So the unemployment rate looks at people and it asks people, do you have a job? Do you have a job? Are you looking for a job? And it focuses on households. These numbers focus on businesses. How many people are on your payrolls today? How many people do you have on your payroll right now? And that green line on here was the 10-year average of monthly employment growth that we've seen, excluding the COVID years when everything got so out of whack. And that was a little over 200,000 jobs a month that we would add, new jobs nationwide. And if you go back through most of 2024, we had been well below that 10-year average of employment growth. And so when the Fed made their rate move, the Fed was looking at this and saying employment growth has been pretty sluggish for a number of months. We don't want it to get worse. Let's go ahead and start lowering our short-term interest rates. But then I think it was September, it was 2.5 weeks ago, we had the September jobs report came out. And so the new numbers for September, and you will see the numbers for September, it jumped up in that last month up to about 250,000 jobs that month. Most analysts were expecting it to be 150 or somewhere around that. So much stronger employment growth in September than everyone thought. That has a lot of us thinking, will this change the Fed's plans moving forward? So I'll come back to this again, but remember that we had a nice story going here. Oh, employment growth is slowing. This is a pace for the Fed to go ahead and lower short-term interest rates. And like economic data is wont to do, it then came and messed with us and gave us a different data point that told a different story. And that was frustrating for us. No, it's good to have good job growth. So at the same time, the Fed is looking at the inflation rate, and the blue line on here is the headline inflation number, and you see that ugly spike from a couple years ago where we topped out at about 9% change in prices at the peak. That was the inflation rate. Since then, the inflation rate has come down, and it's continued to come down where it is below 2.5% now. I think it's now really in a range that is very close to the Fed's inflation target, okay? And I think the Fed was looking at this and they were saying, some of the indicators that we have of where the inflation rate will be going in the future suggest that that path is continuing on towards our target of 2%. But what really matters for mortgage rates isn't the current inflation rate. It's what investors think inflation will be in the future, because those inflation rates in the future will affect the value of the dollars that borrowers pay back on their loans. And so the red line in here on this graph is a survey by the University of Michigan asking households what they think inflation rate will be over the coming year. That's nice, that's useful. But the green line at the bottom is the one that I really like to focus on. It's got a strange name. We call it the 5-year break-even rate. But what you can really think of it as is it's a measure that looks at different treasury securities that are traded in the markets, one of which does not contain any provisions for inflation, the other one that does protect investors against inflation. The difference in interest rates between these provides us with a picture of what financial markets believe the inflation rate will average over the next 5 years. So it's a little bit like the Vegas line when betting on the Chiefs game, okay? They set an initial line, but ultimately what happens is the line moves up or down based on where people are putting money. If they bet for the Chiefs, that's going to raise the point spread for the Chiefs. If they bet against the Chiefs, it will lower that point spread. I'm assuming that the Chiefs are favorites. Woe to those people who bet against the Chiefs last weekend. Did anybody else say, seriously, you're going to bet against Patrick Mahomes when he is a betting line underdog? There's nothing that drives him nuts more than things like that. So again, what we get here, just like the Vegas line, is literally hundreds of billions of dollars of people trading and investing, and their thoughts about what future inflation will be affects whether they choose the traditional treasury security or the inflation protected security. And when they do that, that moves this spread between them. So we can then infer what markets believe inflation will be. And you should notice there that this 5-year break-even rate is just right at 2%. And that is one of the things that the Fed looks at closely to say, yes, I think we're on track. Markets are believing that we're there. The biggest thing the Fed does not want to have happen with inflation, short-term blips of inflation, they're not too concerned about. But when those changes in inflation start to get embedded into contracts, when people begin thinking, oh, we're going to have 5% inflation next year, that then becomes much more difficult for the Fed to break things down. If it's just a one-time change, no big deal. But when it's embedded, when the expectations are there, that's a concern. The expectations are good right now, right? Now, one of the other things the Fed looks at, the way we measure this inflation rate is literally the Bureau of Labor Statistics goes shopping every month. They go and they try and price how much does it cost to buy a new iPhone? How much does it cost to buy a new shirt? How much does it cost to buy tires for my car? How much does it cost to put a gallon of gas in my car? They look everything that American households buy. They go out and shop a price every single month. And then they ask, how do those components change? And they add them all up based on how much of the typical American household budget is spent on these items. What this does, because of the way they do this, it allows us to look at specific subsets of goods and services. And so these are three big components of the inflation index. One of them is the green line, which is energy prices. What are we paying for gasoline for our cars, for natural gas to heat our homes, for electricity to power our homes, all those energy components that we use. And you can see energy is very, very volatile. That's always been the case. It can have big increases, it can have big decreases. Right now, energy prices are actually pulling down the overall inflation rate. The green line is below zero on the latest month. Another one on there are food prices. That's the red line. And food prices too tend to be relatively volatile. They were quite a bit higher back in 2012, but they've really come down and they're not really being a big driver of inflation. So that's coming down. One piece that has been driving inflation has been housing costs or the shelter component. And you might think that this shelter component is being driven by home price appreciation. That's really not the way it's calculated. It turns out that instead, we do a measure of owner's equivalent rent. It is for a renter occupied home, we just ask the rent. What's your rent for that? But for an owner occupied home, when we own our houses, we actually have two things. We have a consumption good, the house that we live in, that we consume, and we also have an investment good, an asset that can appreciate in value. And this sharp increase in home prices has increased this asset value tremendously, but that in the long run, that's going to be closely related to the owner's imputed rent, but it doesn't have to be there in the short term. The way they measure it is they ask households, and then measure other ways as well, what would you have to pay to rent your current house? And so ultimately, what we're really looking at for all of these measures of shelter inflation is what's happening with rents. And rent growth, while it had been very high and is still relatively high, has been slowing. And this measure tends to be lagging of real activity. If you think about just the fact that you lock in your rents for a year at a time, typically, rent growth can be slowing, but you ask me where my rents are today compared to where they were a year ago, they can still be quite a bit higher, even though when I renew in a few months, they won't go up very much. Does that make sense? So this is a lagging measure, but housing inflation is still relatively high. So the blue line on here is the overall headline inflation number. The red line is that shelter component of inflation. And we can see it's still a piece that's pulling things up. So we want to keep an eye on that. And the Fed is thinking about that. It's coming down, but 5% is still a pretty healthy increase in that inflation piece. Okay, so we're getting to the Fed's move. And one of the things that I think is a misperception that we have is that when the Fed makes a move in interest rates, that they're moving all interest rates, but they don't typically. Instead, their primary policy tool, they have some others, but the primary one they focus on is this number called the Fed funds rate. And it is an interest rate that is negotiated between large financial institutions when they lend money to each other, frequently overnight. Okay, so Wells Fargo's got $3 billion just sitting around that it has excess reserves it doesn't need right now. And Bank of America, they're looking at their liquidity position and it's a little bit tight and they need $3 billion. So they may get together and lend, and Wells Fargo might lend $3 billion for one night, for 1 week, very short-term loans. This is the interest rate that they are charging, and the Fed is targeting where that interest rate will be. And so you can see this is what they announced, this is where we want the Fed funds to be. In the past, they just had a target. They now have a range that's typically a 25 basis point range. And so you can see that back in September, they lowered their range, everything across it, by 50 basis points or 1/2 of a full percent. That was a big move and bigger than what a lot of analysts thought that they would do. It was a very definitive statement by the Fed. We think it's time to move and lower interest rates. And so I think I said this when I was up in Lawrence talking, man, you are really gonna geek out with this because there's a lot of economics in here. So yeah, if you fall asleep, that's okay. I won't be offended. This slide looks at interest rates a slightly different way. Again, it is, when we think, here's the way, the yield curve looks at the interest rate that the federal government pays for very short-term loans, say a 3-month treasury note, or a 6-month, or a 1-year, or a 5-year, or a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year. We can look at how much the federal government has to pay for different terms over which they borrow. The way we can get our brains around this concept is by thinking about a 30-year fixed rate mortgage versus a 15-year fixed rate mortgage. Which typically is higher? Are your borrowers going to pay more for a 30-year fixed rate mortgage or a 15-year fixed rate mortgage? The 30-year is higher. The longer the term, the higher the interest rate. And that's a normal state of affairs. We call that an upward sloping yield curve, because if we take the terms and we put them across the bottom, and then we graph the interest rate for each term, the line that we get should be upward sloping, higher for longer terms. These 3 lines each represent the yield curve at 3 different dates. The most recent number is the blue line, October 13th. That's the nearest one I had when I created the presentation. The red line is 6 months ago, and the green line is a year ago. And I want you to notice a couple things with this. First of all 3 of those lines, they're not upward sloping, they're downward sloping, which means that short-term interest rates have been higher than long-term interest rates. This often is thought of as being a predictor of a recession. But what it really means is that financial markets expect that short-term rates will fall in the future. A recession could be one reason. What has been especially unusual is that we've been in a world with an inverted yield curve for about 2 years now. That's just very, very, very unusual. I think what the Fed is really trying to do right now is to normalize interest rates, to bring down the short-term interest rate so that the yield curve is flat or upward sloping the way it should normally be. And you can see here more recently, the most recent numbers, all of the interest rates are substantially lower than they were a year ago, but it's also flatter. And in fact, at the 5 to 10-year range, it's actually started to become upward sloping there. But what the Fed needs to do is get to a place where those short-term interest rates fall enough so that even if the long-term rates stay where they are, we'll get this upward sloping yield curve. I think that's what they're trying to navigate. So what does this mean in terms of mortgage rates? The 30-year fixed mortgage rate is generally benchmarked against the 10-year Treasury security. And I'll show a slide here in a minute that really shows the connection between those two. But when the 10-year Treasury moves up, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate moves up and so forth. So on this graph, I've shown you the 10-year Treasury note and the 1-year Treasury security. And you will see that the 1-year interest rate is higher than the 10-year. Again, that's that inverted yield curve. That's an unusual situation, but it's been here all of this year and indeed for the last 2 years. Okay. I then put on and notice that over the last several months, both of those rates have been coming down. Both the 10-year Treasury and the 1-year Treasury have been coming down. This is financial markets expecting the Fed is going to make a rate move. The Fed is going to make a rate move. Fed's going to bring down interest rates. The green line that's vertical is the September 19th, which is the date that the Fed announced we're lowering our target Fed funds rate, and they lowered those interest rates. And so I wanted to look at what happened with those interest rates following the Fed's move. And I want you to notice that the 1-year Treasury kept coming down, but the 10-year Treasury went up. And this is an important thing to keep in mind. Long-term interest rates do not necessarily move in the same way as short-term interest rates. They may move by different amounts and they may move by different directions as they did in this case. Does that make sense? So again, I think my expectation that we will get here a year and a half from now, and the 10-year Treasury will be bouncing around in the same range where it is right now, but that the 1-year Treasury will now be lower than the 10-year Treasury and will be back to an upward sloping yield curve. I certainly think that if that happens, the Fed will feel like they did a good job with their work. But I also want to show that markets are looking at lots of different things when they're trading. I mean, it's just people trading for the interest. These interest rates are determined by market transactions. And I want to show what happened then after that jobs report came out. You remember that jobs report that was so strong that caught us all by surprise? Here's what happened to those rates after that. Boom. The 10-year Treasury and the 1-year Treasury both jumped up a lot very quickly. Oh my goodness, maybe the Fed is not going to lower those short-term rates as fast or as far as we thought. Some investors may even be thinking this could lead to more inflation and the Fed may raise them again. I don't think that will happen. But that could have been one of the responses that some traders may have had. Okay. So interest rates are just a lot more complicated than we like to think. The Fed's lowering interest rates, the 30-year mortgage rate will come down. No, not necessarily. And here was an example. There's one other piece that's going into these mortgage rates that I think is important to keep in mind, which is, so I mentioned that the 10-year Treasury is the benchmark for the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And you can see the blue line on the top is the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. The red line in the middle is the 10-year Treasury. And indeed, this goes all the way back to 1985. They really move almost in lockstep with one another, right? So you can see that connection. But there's a spread between them. And that spread I think of as the mortgage risk premium. It's how much more we have to pay for our 30-year fixed rate mortgages because it turns out we're not as good at credit risk as the US Treasury. You may say, that can't be. I'm a good credit risk, and look at those yahoos. Well, markets believe that the US Treasury is the closest thing to a risk-free security that we've got. And so we pay a higher interest rate as a result. And that premium for risk with mortgages is remarkably stable over time. It averages about 1.75% over this long period of time, but occasionally it bumps up. You'll see back in 1986, it jumped up to almost 3%, and then it came back down. And it jumped up and hovered around 2% in the early 2000s, and it came back down. Amid the financial crisis in 2008, it jumped up to about 2.5%, and then came back down. In the wake of COVID, we have seen that mortgage risk premium jump up pretty substantially. And while it's been coming down in recent months, it is still above 2% and well above its long-term average. I think this is a component that as that mortgage risk premium stabilizes and becomes more closer to its historical norm, this could be one piece that could help bring mortgage rates down just a little bit further. But for the most part, we are where we're going to be with respect to mortgage rates, okay? There's one more little piece before I get to the mortgage rate forecast, and I'll stop for questions, which has to do with the Fed's purchase of mortgage-backed securities. Prior to 2008, when the financial crisis hit, the Federal Reserve never purchased mortgage-backed securities. But in face of the tremendous turmoil in housing markets following the financial crisis, the Fed began directly buying mortgage-backed securities up to about $1.25 trillion worth of securities over the course of about 2 years. That directly caused mortgage rates to go lower than they would have been otherwise. They then, after a few years of tapering, they doubled that down and they went up to about 1.75 trillion. And then they were coming off of that, and then the pandemic hit and they tripled down up to a level of over $2.5 trillion worth of mortgages. More recently, the Fed has begun unwinding this portfolio. They are not doing it by selling mortgage-backed securities, but instead, they are letting the mortgage-backed securities that they own unwind by simply not replacing them as people pay down their mortgages, okay? Now, when you think about this question and you have buyers who are saying, I'm just going to wait until mortgage rates drop down to 3% again, you can tell them that I said that will never happen again, with one caveat. If it does happen again, it means that financial markets, it means that we have something like the financial crisis where the world literally was about to go off a cliff. I mean, financially, it would have been worse than the Great Depression if the Federal Reserve had not managed that relatively well, keeping that financial crisis from falling off, going so bad. And the other big crisis that we had that really drove those rates down was the pandemic and all the policy responses to that. So we don't want 3% mortgage rates again, because the only way it would happen is if the Fed said the world was falling apart and it needs to quadruple down on its purchases of mortgage-backed securities. As long as they're not buying mortgage-backed securities the way that they were, that's going to keep mortgage rates higher than those artificially low levels that we've seen. And that's where I mean that I think we are now finally back to a place where mortgage rates are normal for the first time in probably 18 years, almost 20 years since prior to the financial crisis. And for those of you that have a long enough history to remember what mortgage rates were like in the 80s and in the 90s, when we got to the early 2000s and we hit mortgage rates of 6.5%, we thought we'd hit nirvana. This is as good as it will ever be. And in some sense, you were right. Where should mortgage rates be in a world where we have low inflation, healthy economic growth, and nothing strange going on in financial crisis? A lot of you have heard me say this before. I think that it ought to be covering real risk-free rates. You have to compensate people for just giving up consumption for the future. That real risk-free rate, real meaning no inflation involved, risk-free, certain to get your money, that ought to be about the real growth rate in the economy. Let's call that 2.5%, give or take. You then need to be compensated for inflation. The Fed's inflation target is 2%, so now up to 4.5%. Then you add in that risk premium, 1.75%, so now you're at 6.25%. I think if you give some ranges to all those things, mortgage rates that are in the range of, say, 5.5% to 7.5%, those are pretty normal mortgage rates that would be consistent with a healthy economy and low inflation and nothing unusual going on that's driving artificially low rates. That's where we are, and I think that's a good thing going forward. Mortgage Bankers Association tends to agree. Their forecast for the 30-year fixed mortgage rate going forward is to drop down to 5.8% by the end of next year. And their longer range forecast basically says that's where it's going to stay. Okay, so we think we're in a steady state, if you want to use an econ term. So questions about mortgage rates before I move on? Was this far too much? So, okay. So what does this mean for housing markets going forward? Well, so this is Wichita area home sales. So it's all the sales reported in South Central Kansas MLS. The blue bars are the actual sales. And the red line is a moving average to get through the seasonality. And what I want you to notice here is that prior to the pandemic, you go to 2018, 2019, sales activity had basically flatlined. We'd gotten to a place where sales were no longer growing, but it wasn't due to a lack of demand. It was because we didn't have much inventory. Then when the pandemic hit, we had this big additional surge in demand. What we really saw was that households were in great financial situation. They couldn't spend their money. They paid down debt. They got lots of stimulus from the federal government and the low interest rates. People said, I'm never going to have an opportunity like this again. I'm going to buy. And we had the feeding frenzy, right? The cow dropped into the Amazon River and the piranhas just absolutely consumed it. And that's what happened in our markets. We saw this artificial increase in home sales activity over that period. When the Fed began its interest rate movements and 30-year fixed mortgage rates began to rise in response, the demand dropped off significantly. And I think there were two things that happened with this. Number one is that we somewhat stole sales in 2021 and 2022 that might have happened later. Oh, I wasn't planning on buying, but I knew I needed to get in on those 30-year fixed mortgage rates that were so low. So I bought before I was planning on it. And then number two, the payment capacity changed. I mean, it was a bucket of water on everybody's face, ice water on everybody's face when those mortgage rates went up, because we've become very used to artificially low mortgage rates. Okay. Since then, over the course of the past year or so, home sales activity has basically leveled off. And I want you to notice that we're back now really at a level that we were back in 2016. Is where we are kind of averaging. My forecast for home sales activity going forward is basically flat. And that forecast is driven not by demand. I think households are adjusting to the new mortgage rate environment and are beginning to recognize this is where we are, this is where we will be. And it's life situations. Excuse me, I've got a lot of I tend to be spitting on people when I'm talking, so forgive me on that. It's like Gallagher, was that it? It's like I'm hitting a watermelon here. So danger if you sit in the front row. I think households, what drives home purchase decisions? In my view, first and foremost, it is life situations. I buy a home because I've got married, because we had children, because I got a new job. Kids are growing up. We have things. I need to downsize because now the kids have moved out. We got a divorce. These are things that drive those transactions. The financial side of it impacts it, but I think it impacts it more on the margin than the driving piece. And I say that in part because I think there may be a couple of you in the room who may have memories of the last time that we were concerned about mortgage lock-in effect. All these people who have the 6% mortgages that they got back in the early 1970s, and now with high inflation in the 80s, when mortgage rates are up at 14%, they don't want to sell because they don't want to lose their mortgage. Well, life happens, and that causes people to bite the bullet and do it anyway. I think the same will be true here. So if demand is, I think, still relatively strong, why are we not seeing new home sales? Well, that is because of the inventory shortage. And this is the number of active listings. Again, I went back as far as I could, back to 2003 in South Central Kansas MLS. And you can see, we actually didn't have a huge surplus of homes after the financial crisis. But home sales activity steadily declined. And by the time we hit that 2018, 2019, remember when I said that home sales kind of flatlined at that point? If you remember my talk at that time, it was, we don't have enough supply. It's a supply problem, not a demand problem. But then the pandemic hit, and the very, the feeding frenzy that happened, the piranhas ate through all of the inventory that was left. They even got the little stuff on the back of the knee bone and everywhere else. I mean, even the crappy properties would go for a premium at that point in time. And since then, we have seen an increase in inventories happen. Not necessarily because of lots of new listings coming on the market, but just the normal pace of new listings, home sales slowed down. But we are still well below where we were back in 2018 and 2019, when we had a shortage of inventory available for sale. And I do believe, and this comes mostly from conversations with all of you, that these inventory levels actually overstate the real supply that we have, because what we're really left with in many cases are the leavings, the things that people didn't want. And so, most of you know, I measure balance in the market by looking at this number of months supply. We take the number of active listings and we divide it by the average pace of sales over the past 12 months. So if you have 1,000 homes on the market, and on average you're selling 200 homes a month, then it would be 1,000 divided by 200, a 5-month supply. And our rule of thumb, it's not magic, it's not anything formal, but our rule of thumb is that a balanced market is between a 4 and a 6-month supply. More than a 6-month supply, we tend to think that we're looking at a market where we have a buyer's market. There's a lot of inventory out there. Below a 4, we tend to think it leans towards a seller's market. You can see right now that we are still just above a 2-month supply here in the Wichita area. Nationwide, it's up just over 4-month supply, but it's still pretty low. By this measure, we would say it's still very much a seller's market. Now, I would caveat this. And so when you have your sellers that you're doing listing presentations and they say, Dr. Longhopper said it's still a seller's market, buyers don't necessarily look at this month's supply number and behave that way. And the word that I get from all the conversations that I've had with you, with your colleagues, and this is not just true in Wichita, it's across most markets in the state, is that buyers have become much more wary. When mortgage rates were super low, they would simply take anything. But now that mortgage rates have come back up to a more normal level, if they can't find what they want, it's not in really good condition, and if it's not priced realistically, okay, then they are walking away. They're not behaving like it's a seller's market unless the property is really good. And so it's almost a bifurcated market. There are the really desirable homes that are positioned properly and everything is good, and that has very much a seller's market. And we are still seeing multiple offer situations and aggressive pricing, offers by buyers. Buyers are willing to be aggressive if they can get what they want, but if they can't, they'll walk away. And so that's a different way that sellers have to think about a seller's market. Okay. Some other numbers that kind of capture and feed into this: median days on market, the number at which half the homes sell faster, half of the homes sell more slowly. And you can see that we are still very, very, very low with that median days on market compared to where we were even prior to the pandemic. But again, this is only the homes that sell. It doesn't speak to the homes that sit. And a seller, you want to be one of the ones that sells, not one of the ones that sits. And so how do you make sure that you're that? You make sure that the house is ready to go. Another way we can look at it is what I call premium listings. What I do is I take what percentage of homes that sell at or above the original listing price. Okay. And historically, I think of 40% as being in premium listings. Most of those would just be at the original list price. I think 40% is a benchmark of a normal market. And you can see following the financial crisis back in 2010 and 11, it dropped down to about 20% of homes sold at or above the original list price. So that would be consistent with a buyer's market. Hey, I can negotiate the price down. Okay. We then came back, we're back up at about 40% of all homes prior to the pandemic. And then in the feeding frenzy that happened, we were up over 60% of all homes sold at or above the original list price. That has definitely slowed down, but again, it's still above where we were prior to the pandemic. And again, that to me says that buyers are willing to be aggressive, but they're only willing to be aggressive if the homes are worth being aggressive over, rather than just doing it for everything. Okay? So what's been happening with home price appreciation? Home price appreciation, the numbers that I have here, these are from the Federal Housing Finance Agency. So it is a true measure of same home appreciation for the Wichita metropolitan area. And it was just under 10% in the second quarter, much higher than I thought it would be. I do think these numbers are subject to revision and can change pretty quickly as new data come in. So we'll see where that comes in. Our forecast for home price appreciation is still very strong for Wichita area. We think that it'll be about 8% over the course of this year, and then next year, another 7.7%. That is much more reasonable than the insane numbers that we saw in 2021, 2022, and even 2023. But it's still almost twice what is normal for Wichita market when you're in low inflation and a normal balanced market. So home prices, we think, will still continue to appreciate, just not at the insane levels that they were for a couple of years. And why do we have the shortage of inventory? What I really want to point to is, so this is a single family building permits in the Wichita area going all the way back to 1990. And notice what happened in the face of the financial crisis back in 2008. New home construction collapsed. It collapsed nationwide. And the thing that I really want to emphasize, we've been coming back up a little bit. We got to a place where we were at about 1,500 permits a year, which I think is a healthy number for Wichita's market. When mortgage rates went up, those building permit numbers came back down again. And the pricing is challenging. New home construction is so costly. And when you couple that with higher mortgage rates, it really limits the entry level new home buyers, which is a strange thing to say. Those who want to buy a home in, say, the $350,000 price range, $400,000, they're the ones that were most impacted by that increase in mortgage rates. It really put them in a position where it was untenable for a lot of them to be able to make those purchases. That's going to take some time for that to re-normalize and for people to say, okay, I can do that. A lot of the new home construction that we have then is really at the upper end, more luxury market. But here's the real problem that we have in the existing home market has to do with the drop off that we had going back in 2009, 2010, 2011. If you think about it, those homes that were not built then would have been homes that would have been in the $200,000 to $300,000 price range back then, right? And those could be the $250,000 to $350,000 existing homes that move-up buyers would be moving in today. Those people would move into the 10-year-old homes. They're not there. And so that filtering element of the housing market is a really important piece to think about long-term supply issues. It took us 15 years to get into the supply situation that we're in. We need to expect that it's going to take a long time to get back out of it. And it's, again, challenging because cost of construction is so much higher today that it's really hard to price in at more modest price points that move-up buyers can get into. One area where I do see some potential of hope is in two-family homes and indeed townhomes. You could go to three-family, four-family attached housing. Now, a lot of this has been built as what I call apartment complexes with 2 units per building. A lot of these are not designed for owner-occupied, but in many cases, they still could be converted to owner-occupied pretty easily. And so this type of twin home construction, I think, does open up the possibility of getting into a more competitive price point that helps build. But again, it's going to take a long time to get there. And unfortunately, our forecast for new home sales activity is basically flat. I'm sorry, new home construction is basically flat. A little bit down this year, a little bit up next year. But if I took these bars all the way back to the 1990s and the early 2000s, they'd be above the top of the screen as to where they were. So we're still pretty low compared to where we need to be to address those long-term supply issues. And that is everything. And I think I took more time than I was allotted. And I want to make sure you have time for your panel discussion to do that. So I'm going to step back and turn things back over so that you can do your panel discussion. And then I'm happy to take questions after we're all done, when we're done with that. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Sam. Could I please have our panelists come up front? There are 3 lovely chairs for you. You would help me welcome Ann Williams, John Quincy, and Amelia Summerall, please. I'm gonna pass the mic and we're gonna start with Amelia. I think we've only got one, so we're gonna have to share. Oh, so you think we should start with John?
You thought Miss Newman?
Okay, there you
Take it like a man. Can you hear me?
Yeah, she said she's gonna take one from me. Okay, first question, were you licensed during the 2008 market crash? And if so, how long had you been in business? And how did you overcome the difficult market to keep your business going?
Yes, I had been licensed 22 years when 2008 came around, but I'm only 25. So I'm still young, but anyway, we had to do different ideas within our office on what we could, get people into these houses. I have these great houses and nobody came to see them because they were, you'd have 10 houses in Hawthorne or College Hill and nobody saw them. So I did an incentive of a little gift card to send out to agents who showed my listing. Cleared it with KREC and they are picky about what you can do. So yeah, I had to get permission from every broker that I could send the gift card to each agent because it was compensation. So I did it as a thank you. And what that did was, if there's some kind of incentive you can give, is get, what happened was exactly what I wanted to happen. It was more of a bribe to get agents to look at my house. If there were 15 houses and they were only going to show 8, they'd show one of mine because they got some. And so at the end of the week, we sent out gift cards, and we got $5 Target gift cards, or Quick Trip. Yeah, a lot of y'all have gotten them. So I think it does make a difference. It's expensive. It's expensive doing it. And the places I chose, of course, don't get bulk because they're too popular. But another thing I did when it was a little slow, and I think most of you, how many people here are under 35? Anybody in their 20s? Oh my God, some babies over there. I think I came down to the board office and went to a lot of things just to learn, because I didn't have much to do. And right now, I'll tell y'all, I'm slow. It's the slowest year I've had in, probably 15 years. But you can't freak out. And you can't, and looking at these graphs, sometimes the graphs are over my head. And I'm not really stupid. I graduated from the University of North Carolina, summa cum laude, so I have some brains. I don't have a lot of brains for the graphs. But this guy has the best graphs ever.
Yeah.
And I can look up and I can follow them, and I'm like, oh my gosh. So any seminar you can go to or learn about from anybody else, I think you should do it. Another thing I think you should do is, and a lot of people in my office do this, I say, go to one of the top agents or most successful agents in your office and ask to shadow them for a day. If you're bored in your office, I always tell agents, you come just sit in my office and listen to my conversations. And you can learn more by doing that than about anything. And most agents would help you. And I mean, if you're really aggressive, you could go to that agent and say, hey, I'll be for 5 days or something for free, and say, I'll take anything you can give me. I'll take a $20,000 house. I'll show houses for you. I'll do anything. And that's how you can get some business without having to go do it all on your own and figure that out. So, sorry, that was bad.
The real Amelia Summer.
Yeah. That's why.
Good follow that, thanks for that. So 2008, the financial crisis crash, I've been licensed about a year at that time, not 22 years, about a year. I was lucky enough, I didn't have a lot of life responsibilities then either. So I remember people asking, what are you thinking getting into real estate right now? And I thought, well, if I can make it through this, I'll be fine making it through any market. And that's just it, you gotta have some faith, you gotta put your head down and go to work and don't panic. We are lucky to be in the Midwest where things move kind of slow and steady. We don't have those big upswings and big downticks. And I talk to brokers across the country, and every time I do, it makes me thankful we're here in the Midwest too. You mentioned the incentives, and I tell these stories in our offices all the time about some of the extreme ones we saw back then. And I remember a house that was for sale, and with an acceptable offer, you got a car. It was, people were doing that stuff. You saw a lot of cruises, a lot of iPads given away. Don't get any weird ideas out there yet. We're not that desperate, but there were a lot of incentives when the market was slow. It's a whole different market than it was back then. So just, you mentioned the education. Yeah, come down here, take every class 2 or 3 times over again. You're going to get something else out of it. It's definitely worth it. And yeah, look up to the people that have been in the business a long time, and they'll help you out.
Thank you.
Well, I was licensed in February of '09 and probably too stupid to know what I was really getting into, and probably had an abundance of self-confidence and not a lot of knowledge. But, I think that the most important thing to remember is all businesses are going to go through cycles, no matter what career you're in. I was in aviation for a long time. We had layoffs, we had ups, we had downs, and just not to worry about it so much. Just stay the course. Keep doing the things that work for you. And I'm a proponent of doing what works for you. And maybe it might not be a mainstream activity, but if it feels good to you, if you like taking people to lunch or being involved in lots of clubs, I think everybody's different. You just have to follow your own path and do what you love and not get so freaked out in it. I don't think there are bad markets. There's maybe not just as good a markets as others. And, you're gonna have some good and some bad. So I say just roll with it.
Thank you, Ann. I'm gonna let you keep it, and we're gonna start with our next question. What are some business practices that you are currently implementing in our current real estate situation? And what tips do you have for your peers?
Well, again, I don't think I probably follow a lot of the mainstream activities, but I think social media is by far and away the biggest thing you can do to keep yourself, visible, and so that people know you're selling. I think you can create an image for your real estate business that is a lot grander than it really is if you really spend some time on social media. And I think how you put your social media together is a super important thing, how you package it. And that's one thing I work on pretty hard, you know, I do drone videos and all that sort of thing. And I like to have my graphics prepared professionally, and I'm not a proponent of just going on and throwing out any social media thing that might come up that day. So I just say, I've been trying to keep things professional and make people be aware that I'm still in the business and happy to serve them and exceed their expectations.
Thank you.
You know, a lot of the message I've been trying to pass on is, yeah, customer service. If you take care of your customers today, that will take care of most of your business right there. And treat it like a business, take it seriously, and don't get lazy in these slower times, which is easy to do and get distracted with laundry and dishes and everything else. Get up and get to the office in the morning, and take it seriously, and it'll work out.
I think don't get all freaked out about the press and the media and what's going on out there. Because if you get into that, you will go into a small hole. Because it may not be, you know, this is stuff from Wichita. This is the best stuff to listen to. If you listen to something on ABC News, it's about the whole country, and we're so different. But if don't listen, if it's not that it's going to say what you want to hear, but sometimes it brings you down, and avoid it. I mean, you do need to know what's going on in the market, but you're not an economist. So I don't know that you need to keep following that. The pictures and the drone videos, we do that on all our listings. There's some listings we don't do drones on because it's not drone worthy. I mean, it's good, but it's small. It's just gonna make the lots look smaller. So just think about that. And then for your appointments, if you have your son's soccer game at 10 o'clock on Saturday and somebody wants to see a house at 10:30, here's what you say. I have appointments in the morning. Could we go at 1? Don't say I have my son's soccer game, even though they should understand that. They're more interested that you're busy with other clients and that kind of thing. So don't just drop everything and dump your family so that you can show a house or two. Something I started doing videos of my listings, and I just have a mic and somebody from my team follows me, and I give a 2-minute trip through the listing. If you go longer than 2 minutes, they'll cut you off. Nobody will keep looking. So I can tell on my Instagram how many people looked at the full thing. So that, and you can do that. And the less you practice and the more natural you are, the more it's going to appeal to people. So don't practice it. But get somebody to film you, because if you film it right here, most of us don't look great right here. Maybe some of those 20 and 30-year-olds. Yeah. But just be natural on that. One thing I started doing, and this was back in 2008 when I wasn't doing anything else, is every year everybody gets their taxes, what their tax went up to on their house. And then I have the 15 calls that come in that say, can you help me find taxes? Okay, do it. And I'm sorry, I hate it for any broker that's in here, but work for free, right? Do that. Work for free. And something you might do when taxes come out, pull up the taxes, pull up what that person paid or what some of your clients paid, and see if they should. And then call them and say, hey, I think it's worth possibly fighting your taxes. So you're doing something for them that's free and that could potentially really help them. So that's one of the things I did. And I just automatically did it. And some of them were less than what they pay. You know, some of them you don't want to get everybody to fight them, because sometimes it's not going to work. I mean, they're at the value they should be. But that's something I did. If you're under 35 and you're selling real estate, you deal with a lot of 50-year-olds and plus. And the 50-year-olds and plus, they like to talk. They don't want to text. Some of them don't even know really what they're doing with texting. So you're going to have to pick up the phone. And I know that is really hard, especially for the 20-somethings, because they haven't even talked to their best friend in 10 years. But they talk to them on text twice a day. So with your clients, you need to be more professional, return the calls when you can, and all that.
All right, let's let John start this one. Okay. What is the biggest lesson you have learned navigating through changes in the real estate landscape and or a difficult market?
Biggest lesson learned, I think I mentioned on that earlier is don't have knee-jerk reactions and have a little bit of faith and you'll be fine. Partner up with the right people to partner up with and you know, don't panic. You know, a lot of people in 2008 decided this was the market they signed up for and they went to retire. And you hear that now, people with the COVID market, a lot of people were not having fun anymore. It was tough. Get your butts kicked, but just have faith and be positive.
I think it's pretty much the same answer for me, except for I think one thing I keep doing over and over and over again is trying to educate buyers and sellers that the market is different, the market is evolving, and things aren't always going to be the same. I mean, they seem to have a really hard time listening to you because I do think, as you mentioned, they listen to the national media and the national media loves to blow it out of proportion, in my opinion. So just stay calm and educate your people and things usually work out.
All right, I'm gonna go to a different question now and I'm gonna give it to Amelia. What advice would you have for your peers? These are probably gonna be some of the more seasoned people in the room. I'm not gonna say older. What advice do you have for your peers to prevent burnout or keep them from getting discouraged?
I think that you have to take some time to yourself, and that doesn't mean your husband, wife, kids. You need some time by yourself every day to go sit outside or take a drive or whatever it is you do. And I think when you're having dinner with your family or your kids, your phone needs to be elsewhere because it hurts the feelings of the kids. And I have a 23-year-old and a 25-year-old. And I was in the boom of when they were growing up, and I was really careful to not have that phone now. Now, granted, offers come in at 7 o'clock at night, and they might have a deadline, so you got to do it. But I think if you can give yourself time and turn your phone off when you go to bed, because there's nobody that, unless you have a child out on the road or somewhere else, turn it off. Don't let it beep through the night and you hear it. I think that is what could really make you burn out. And we look at our phones way too much. And most of the time it's Facebook or Instagram. It's not really, oh, I'm learning stuff about real estate. No, you're not. So I would say get rid of the phones. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've taken a lot of wrong turns in the business, and you learn from your mistakes. And they say, my dad always said, experience is what you get when you didn't get what you wanted. So I'm very experienced. But don't get down on it. It could be slow. I mean, I'm really slow right now, and I have 3-4 people that work with me, and I don't want to lay them off. I mean, because I know it'll come back. But you got to stick through it, and don't have yourself a pity party. Go to somebody else in your office, the broker or something, and say, hey, I'm down. Talk to me. And get a pep talk from them, or any peers that are real positive. But if you go and see that peer and that peer's down like you, oh my God, the sky is falling. Get another friend. Yeah. Because you're going to be pulled down with them. So.
Yeah, misery loves company, right? You gotta be careful there. Yeah, take a break, take a vacation. I think, and you guys are not good at that at all. You work way too hard. In general, this business is a lot of fun. I mean, you take pride in what you do, but take time off. And that's hard to say. But like you said, shut the phone off, put family first and everything else will work out fine.
No, I don't think I really have anything significant to add other than just don't be afraid to take a step back, and may not be family, but maybe you just need a day of watching Netflix. I mean, it's funny how your attitude can get kind of not so good, and 24 hours you could turn it around pretty quick. Just do something for yourself.
Okay, everybody good for one more question? Are you learning something from these fine people up here? Okay, this one's a good one. if you could only do one thing in your real estate business to be successful and had to let go of all other business practices, what would it be? One thing.
Exceed expectations, go the extra mile.
Short and simple, really. Yeah, customer service, sure.
You know, if I had to keep one thing, I'd probably keep my phone because I can do everything on that. And also keep my team as long as I can, because they have become cheerleaders and everything like that. But I think the main thing is it's gonna be slow sometimes and you can't just change your mind. I mean, what other job in the world? You can do this with a GED. Nobody needs to have gone to college. You don't have a lot of student loans if you didn't go to college, of course. And you can work your own hours. And sometimes somebody says, well, that means I work weekends and all that and holidays. But that's where you have to set a boundary and say, I can show you tomorrow, but I can't show you today. Or I can show you set up a different time. But if you just say, I can't go, then you can't. I mean, that's not gonna help anybody. So work within your timeline and go when you can, because you get a lot better information from people from face to face. So.
If you guys would put your hands together and thank them. Thank you, guys. Good answers. All of that is really good advice. One thing that I do want to just reiterate is with the NAR settlements and the changes that have come with that, please make sure that you are getting your information from the proper sources and make sure that when you are educating the public and educating your brokerages and speaking with your peers, that you are sharing good information and reliable information, and that we are all staying positive and supporting each other during this time, because it is us in the end that will keep this industry going and keep the industry's name good and alive. So with that, Sheila, do we have anything else?
You want to see if anyone has questions?
Questions for Stan about the market, about the next year?
I beat you all into submission.
So. Thank you. I'm curious to see, one of the things we haven't talked a little bit about is the affordability index for housing in Wichita, right? So we know that, wages haven't necessarily kept up with the rise of inflation and things of that nature. Do you have any thoughts on what our affordability is kind of forecasted to be from this?
I haven't looked at the specific numbers for the Wichita Affordability Index here recently, but following kind of what has been happening. We all tend to follow the national trends because the driving force of the affordability index, it's basically composed of the median sale price and what would you have to pay to get that, and then also the mortgage rates. And so nationally, all markets tend to move at the same way in the same direction. The difference is just the median sale prices that you have across those markets. And one of the things that I think when people looked at, all the changes in the housing affordability indexes that happened when mortgage rates went up, is they're going, oh my goodness, it's, the affordability is going down, 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 down. You have the high increase of home prices coupled with the increase in mortgage rates, and it really caused affordability index to get much worse. What people really didn't think about is the fact that the affordability index was at historically good levels during the, when the mortgage rates were so low. And so they were at the lowest, best affordability numbers that we had seen ever in the history of those indices. And where we ended up after those changes is actually a lot more consistent with where we were back in the late 80s and early 90s. And so affordability numbers are painful compared to where we were recently, but they're actually not that much out of whack historically, if that makes sense. I'll go over there and I'll come back there. Yeah.
With the volatile general election that's coming up, a lot of the clients that we've been visiting with are holding off to see what happens. With the research that you guys have done, is there any correlation with general elections? And what should we expect moving forward?
The question is whether there's any correlation with the federal, US presidential election and the four-year election cycle and anything that goes on in the housing markets. And the short answer is we can never identify anything like that. I think individuals may say that they're affected, but they're always going to say they're affected by something. And I would say to the extent that that is true, then the buyers who are willing or the sellers who are willing to say, I'm going to go into the market, even though everybody else is uncertain about it, they're the ones who are going to have the better opportunities out of that. But we haven't found anything. I think I saw a hand over here.
I know you spoke a little bit about the multifamily sector, with the duplexes and everything, new construction being built. I know it's more affordable for buyers to get into, half of a duplex, new construction. Do you see with the influx of duplexes being built across Wichita, it's going too many, too much? I mean, do you have any information on that?
So the question is, with the big increases we've seen in duplex construction, are we seeing too much and could we be overbuilding in that particular segment? I have heard some people say that some of the rentals are not renting as quickly as some of them thought with some of those duplexes. I'm relatively sanguine about the choice of building owner-occupied home versus renter-occupied home, as long as we're building something that can move back and forth. I might build a duplex with the intention that I build it for rental occupancy. But if I don't get the rents that I need, if my occupancy rates are too low, I always have the option to sell it to someone else. And again, one of the things that I really hope that we look at and are really cautious about is to the extent that we can actually plat these homes so that they are not a duplex on a single lot, but actually have a lot split that's built in with it, then it becomes particularly easy where somebody wants to buy half, they can buy half. And the other half could be owned by somebody else as a rental, or I could still buy both, the traditional way of buying a duplex and living in half, but it's be two separate lots, which, that can be done. So I'm not too stressed. We have such a shortage of housing units that are out there. I'm not too stressed as long as we're building a quality product about overbuilding in terms of we don't have enough demand for the rentals, because I think we have a lot of demand for owner occupied.
Is it on?
Yeah.
I was just thinking about the graphs you had up there. A lot of those are not in the booklet.
Mhm.
And you can get those. My sellers are thinking, some of them are thinking they're selling in the pandemic. Because that they remember John down the street, he got 550 for his house. My house is better than his. I mean, we all have the same sellers. But I think if you took some of these graphs and actually gave them to the seller, of course, they're still going to twist it to what they wanted to say. But this is an easy graph. These graphs are easy for somebody to look at, and it could help, you not have to beat them up as much. And you try not to beat them up because they'll find somebody else if you do.
And I'd give two more thoughts along those lines. Number one is you can point your sellers and buyers to the Center for Real Estate website. And one of the things that I've always said, 90% of the time, I'm going to probably say things that realtors appreciate and want to have said. 10% of the time, I may say some things that you just wish that guy would shut up. But it's that 10% of the time that I'm saying something you don't like that actually then gives credibility for the other 90%, that I'm not just it's not a marketing material for you. It's something that they can rely on as an outside objective voice. And if you send them to our website, you can go and you can find our old presentations are all on there. So you can go and you can point them to the exact page and you can give them the page, this is the slide number to look at. That way they know it's not something you've manipulated. The other thing I'll just mention, Elena said you are recording this session here. I'm assuming you'll then make that available on YouTube. And so you could actually point them to a time code of something from this presentation if they wanted to hear it was really coming from my mouth, not from yours.
One more thing, I do have a good line when I went to seller, and I never lose my temper. I'm not volatile. I'm busy and I have ADD and I move my hands. But if the seller says, well, I want to price it at 250 and my market study says 220, what I like to say is, I think that's overly optimistic. But sometimes the numbers aren't right, but the numbers don't support your 250. So if we put it on the market, we're gonna have to get somebody to overpay if they love the house enough. And I think that we're pricing ourselves out of the range. There's a high and a low end, and I think the low end is 220, the high end is 240. So I think we should be more realistic, as opposed to saying, you're smoking crack, or I can't sell it for that, or you need to find somebody else. If you just say, I think that's overly optimistic, that's not offensive as much as some of the things I've heard people say.
But I love my house. Everybody else will love it just as much.
And you know, they probably will, Stan, but not everybody likes that green check carpet. I know it's coming back, but you know, and not everyone wants to come into a house.
But mine is original. They don't have to buy the new stuff. They can get the stuff from the 1970s.
But what about your 9 cats?
So I have a quick question for Amelia. If you're gonna say, I believe that's overly optimistic, how do you control your face?
Just a plain stare. That is overly optimistic. And even if they said, if the house is really, really cute and the market range is 220 to 240 and they want to list it 250, but it's a really good house, I'd list it. Because we don't know what's going to sell. We don't know what people are going to like. And you don't want to lose it because after 3 weeks, you can say, okay, we did try and that's been asked and answered. And I think we should drop the price a little to get more people into the house. You know, just be nice. Don't try to bully them.
It's the accent.
It's
the accent.
I have another question here.
I have a question. With the aircraft industry, with the dogs, and so they're all getting their strikes settled, and they're all getting pay increases. I would think that'd be a good incentive for buyers.
Well, again, the challenge that we have isn't having buyers. The challenge is supply. And so I think I don't disagree with you in that regard. I would, you know, from the things I've read about some of the strike settlements, they sound like, oh my goodness, they're getting what kind of pay increases and so forth. I suspect that if you actually went down and looked at some of the details, it doesn't translate into quite as much into the bottom line of the workers who are getting those. It's probably a pretty fair deal in terms of where they've been, what they maybe didn't get pay increases in the past and all those things. But certainly it's a good thing for our economy and for our community that those strikes are getting settled. That was a concerning piece. Hopefully with Boeing getting settled, that also is a big impact. But again, demand still is strong. There are people out there who would like to buy, but they got to find something that they want to buy that they can reach into. So.
Okay, thank you all for being here. Thank you for being involved.